Rachel had always envisioned her dream home as a place of tranquility, where she could escape the chaos of the city and find inspiration for her art. When she finally found it, a charming property on the outskirts of a quiet suburban neighborhood, it seemed perfect. The house was an old craftsman-style build with weathered wooden siding and a sprawling front yard dotted with wildflowers. The driveway, though slightly cracked, wound elegantly toward the house, lined with tall oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. To Rachel, it was not just a house, it was a sanctuary, a retreat where she could focus on her next big gallery exhibition without distraction. The first week after moving in was uneventful, filled with unpacking, rearranging furniture, and late-night brainstorming sessions for her upcoming art pieces. Her mornings were spent sipping coffee on the porch, watching the sunlight dapple through the leaves, and sketching ideas in her notebook. It was a slice of peace she hadn't experienced in years until the day her neighbor, Douglas, appeared. Douglas arrived unannounced one afternoon, his shadow stretching across her porch as Rachel was rearranging a set of potted plants. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with a broad, commanding presence and an air of quiet authority. His clothes were neat but unremarkable: khaki pants, a tucked-in flannel shirt, and scuffed boots. What caught Rachel off guard, however, was the way he looked at her house, not with curiosity or warmth, but with something closer to appraisal. His eyes lingered on her driveway, then shifted to the oak tree that stood proudly at the center of her yard. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his voice calm but edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Lot of character." Rachel smiled politely, though the interaction already felt strange. "Thanks. I feel really lucky to have found it." Douglas nodded, still looking past her. "Been living here long?" "Just moved in last week," Rachel said, brushing dirt off her hands, still getting settled. "Well," Douglas said, his gaze finally meeting hers, "you might want to double-check your property lines. These older lots can be tricky. Boundaries aren't always where you think they are." Rachel frowned slightly. "I had a survey done before buying the place. Everything seemed fine." He gave a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Just something to keep in mind. Boundaries change, you know, especially out here." Before she could respond, Douglas tipped his head in a vague gesture of farewell and walked off toward his own house, which was partially obscured by a row of overgrown hedges. Rachel stood there for a moment, unsettled. There was something about his tone, calculated, almost practiced, that stuck with her. But she shook it off, deciding that he was probably just one of those eccentric neighbors who like to assert their presence early. Besides, she had bigger things to focus on. Over the next few days, Rachel began noticing Douglas more often. He would appear seemingly out of nowhere, walking along the edges of her property or standing at the corner of her driveway, as though inspecting something. Once she caught him staring at her oak tree again, his arms crossed. When she waved at him from the porch, he gave a curt nod and turned away without a word. It was disconcerting, but Rachel reasoned that it wasn't worth making a fuss over. Maybe he was just the type to keep to himself. Then, one morning, Rachel found an envelope tucked into her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a vaguely worded note that read, "Be mindful of shared spaces. Not everything is as clear-cut as you think." The handwriting was neat, almost formal, and unsigned. She stared at it, confused and vaguely uneasy. Was this some kind of passive-aggressive complaint? Or a warning? She decided to ignore it, crumpling the paper and tossing it in the trash. The first real sign of trouble came less than a week later. Rachel woke up to the sound of machinery, a loud, grating noise that sent her heart racing. She threw on a jacket and hurried outside, only to find a team of workers tearing up her driveway. A bulldozer sat idling at the edge of the property, and a pile of broken concrete was heaped to one side. Douglas was standing nearby, hands on his hips, directing the workers as though he were overseeing a personal project. "What the hell is going on?" Rachel demanded, marching up to him. Douglas turned to her, unbothered by her tone. "Morning, Rachel. Thought I'd get an early start. This driveway? It's on my property." Rachel blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about? This is my driveway. I have the deed, the survey, everything." Douglas shrugged, his expression maddeningly calm. Paperwork doesn't always match reality. I've lived here for 20 years. That driveway's been mine since day one. You're welcome to get another survey done if you like. But until then, I'm reclaiming what's mine. You can't just rip up my driveway, she shouted, her voice rising with anger. This is trespassing. You're destroying my property. Douglas raised an eyebrow, his tone turning colder. Not your property if it's on my land. Like I said, feel free to take it up with the county. But until then, I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of the way. Don't want anyone getting hurt. Rachel clenched her fists, her heart pounding with frustration and disbelief. She looked at the workers, who avoided meeting her gaze, and the pile of rubble where her driveway had been. It was surreal, like a scene from a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, she said through gritted teeth. Douglas smirked. Do what you need to do. Just remember it's nothing personal. Just business. He turned away, leaving Rachel standing there in a mix of rage and helplessness. She stared at the mess before her, the sound of machinery roaring in her ears, and felt an unsettling certainty settle in her gut. This was only the beginning. The morning after the driveway incident, Rachel awoke to a jarring sound, the harsh screech of a truck's tires grinding against gravel. The noise pulled her from her sleep, and she stumbled to the window, heart racing. Outside, a large tow truck was parked near her property line. Two of her cars, which had been parked further down the driveway due to the ongoing construction mess, were being hooked up and hauled away. Rachel grabbed her phone and ran outside, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The driver of the tow truck barely acknowledged her as she approached, his hands steady as he tightened the chains around the wheels of her SUV. Stop. What the hell do you think you're doing? She shouted, her voice cutting through the noise of the engine. The driver, a burly man in a faded uniform, didn't look up. Got orders to tow these vehicles. Unauthorized parking. Unauthorized? These are my cars. This is my driveway. Rachel's hands trembled as she gestured toward her house. This is private property. Finally, the driver paused, pulling a clipboard from his truck. Not according to what I've got here, he said, his tone dismissive. He handed her a paper that bore an official-looking letterhead, along with a signature she immediately recognized. It was Douglas's. The note read, "These vehicles are obstructing my property. They must be removed immediately." Rachel's blood boiled. She turned to the driver. "This isn't his property. This is mine. He has no right." The man held up a hand, cutting her off. "Look, lady, I don't care who owns what. I've got a work order, and I'm doing my job. If you have a problem, take it up with the guy who signed this." Before Rachel could argue further, the driver climbed back into his truck and started the engine. One by one, both vehicles were towed off, disappearing down the street. Rachel stood frozen on the edge of her driveway, her breath coming in short, furious gasps. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of birdsong and the distant sound of construction equipment from another street. She stormed back inside, dialing Douglas's number with shaking hands. It went straight to voicemail. "You have no right to tow my cars," she snarled into the phone. "If you think you can keep doing this, you're in for a rude awakening. This isn't over." Slamming the phone down, she realized that she couldn't waste any more time confronting him directly. Douglas wasn't just a nuisance, he was systematically testing how far he could push her. If she didn't act decisively, this would only escalate. Her next call was to her lawyer, Mark, a sharp and no-nonsense professional who had helped her close on the property. When Rachel explained the situation, Mark's tone shifted from casual to serious. "He towed your cars without proper cause?" "That's illegal," Mark said. "Did you get a copy of the towing authorization?" "Yes, he signed it himself. He's claiming the driveway is his, but my survey clearly shows it's on my land." "Good. Hold on to that paper," Mark instructed. "It's evidence of his overreach. I'll look into the legal options, but in the meantime, I want you to document everything: dates, times, photos, anything that shows what's happening. This kind of dispute can get messy fast, and we need a solid case to push back." Rachel spent the next hour walking the perimeter of her property, taking photos of the torn-up driveway, the pile of rubble, and the spot where her cars had been parked before they were towed. Her mind raced as she replayed Douglas's words over and over. Boundaries change. It's nothing personal, just business. When she returned inside, her mailbox caught her eye. There was another envelope, identical to the first one she'd received. This time, the note inside read, "You're only making this harder on yourself. It's best to cooperate." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. The note wasn't just a passive-aggressive jab, it was a warning. She clenched her fists, her frustration mounting. How could someone be so brazen, so willing to manipulate and intimidate without any regard for the consequences? The rest of the day passed in a blur. She filed a police report about the unauthorized towing, but the officer who took her statement seemed indifferent, chalking it up to a neighborly dispute. When she pressed further, he sighed and said, "These things usually get sorted out in civil court. We can't do much unless there's a criminal offense." Feeling defeated, Rachel returned home and tried to focus on her artwork. But the sketches she attempted came out jagged and tense, reflecting the turmoil inside her. Every sound outside, the rumble of a passing truck, the snap of a twig in the yard, made her jump. By the time evening rolled around, she was exhausted. She sat on the porch with a mug of tea, staring out at the disheveled mess of her property. Her sanctuary, the peaceful haven she had dreamed of, now felt like a battleground. Just as she began to relax, she noticed movement near the oak tree in her front yard. Squinting in the dim light, she saw Douglas standing there, his silhouette unmistakable. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, arms crossed, staring at the tree, as if it held some great secret. Rachel's anger flared anew. She marched down the porch steps and called out, "What do you think you're doing on my property?" Douglas turned slowly, his face unreadable in the fading light. "Just admiring the view," he said, his tone calm and deliberate. "Shame about the mess, though. Wouldn't have happened if you just agreed to my terms." "Get off my land," Rachel snapped, her voice shaking with fury. Douglas smirked. "Your land, huh? We'll see about that." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the shadows without another word. Rachel stood there for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. She realized then that this wasn't just a petty feud over a driveway or property lines. Douglas was playing a larger game, one that she didn't yet fully understand. And if she wanted to protect her home, she would need to be ready for whatever came next. Inside, she began drafting an email to Mark, detailing everything that had happened. She included photos, descriptions, and even a copy of the cryptic notes Douglas had left. As she typed, a new determination took hold of her. Douglas wanted her to feel helpless, cornered, but she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. If he wanted a fight, he was going to get one, and she wasn't about to lose. The following morning, Rachel woke up to an eerie quiet outside her home. After the chaos of the previous day's machinery tearing up her driveway, cars being towed, and cryptic notes from Douglas, the silence felt unnatural, almost deliberate. She dressed quickly, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach, and stepped out onto her porch. Her driveway was still in shambles, chunks of broken concrete scattered everywhere, but something else caught her eye immediately: several wooden stakes driven into the ground along what Douglas claimed was the property line. Bright orange tape was strung between them, like a makeshift barrier. Rachel's jaw clenched as she descended the porch steps. She approached the stakes, inspecting them closely. Each one was hammered deep into the soil, as if to say, "This is permanent." The orange tape flapped in the light breeze, a silent taunt. Her mind raced. When had he done this? She hadn't heard anything overnight. Had he waited until she was asleep to make his move? Before she could process her next steps, the familiar sound of a heavy truck engine rumbled in the distance. She turned her head sharply to see another vehicle, a large delivery truck, pulling into the cul-de-sac. It stopped right in front of her house, and two men in uniform stepped out. One began unloading large bags of gravel, while the other set down several orange cones. Rachel marched over, her temper flaring. "Excuse me," she called, her voice firm. "What are you doing?" One of the men glanced at her with mild disinterest before replying. "We've been contracted to deliver materials for a new driveway." He nodded toward the stakes and tape. "We're starting over there." "Starting over there?" Rachel repeated incredulously. "That's my property. You can't just show up and start dumping gravel without my permission." The man shrugged. Look, lady, we're just following orders. This was all approved by the client. He handed her a clipboard with the paperwork. Sure enough, Douglas's name was scrawled across the bottom, along with a vague description of the project. The document claimed the work was part of a restoration effort for Douglas's supposed portion of the land. Rachel's hands trembled as she handed the clipboard back. I'm telling you right now, this is a mistake. That's my property, and if you so much as touch it, I'll hold your company responsible. The worker sighed, clearly used to dealing with difficult situations, and motioned to his partner. We're going to need confirmation before we can proceed, he muttered, pulling out his phone. They retreated to their truck, leaving Rachel standing there seething. She wasted no time calling her lawyer, Mark. He picked up on the second ring, his tone sharp. Rachel, what's going on? Douglas is escalating, she said, her voice tight. He's hired contractors to start building a driveway on my land. They're here right now. Mark let out a low whistle. That's bold, even for him. Did they actually start construction? Not yet, but they brought materials. Stakes and tape are already up. Good. Get pictures of everything: stakes, tape, the truck, their paperwork, everything. I'll start drafting an injunction to stop any further action. This is blatant overreach. Rachel exhaled slowly, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Thanks, Mark. I'll get the pictures now. She spent the next hour meticulously documenting the scene, taking photos from every angle. The workers remained in their truck, talking on their phones and occasionally glancing in her direction. She could feel their unease growing as the situation dragged on, but Rachel didn't care. She wasn't going to back down. By the time she returned inside, her phone buzzed with a new email from Mark. He'd already filed the injunction, and had also sent her a copy for her records. As she scrolled through the document, relief washed over her. At least now she had something concrete to fight back with legal action to stop Douglas from overstepping further. But the relief was short-lived. That afternoon, Rachel heard a loud crash from the side of her house. Heart pounding, she ran to the window and froze. One of the workers had accidentally backed the delivery truck into her mailbox, flattening it completely. The driver was outside, inspecting the damage with an exaggerated air of apology, while the other worker muttered something under his breath. Rachel stormed out of the house, phone in hand, already recording. What the hell are you doing? She demanded, her voice shaking with fury. This is deliberate. The driver threw up his hands defensively. Hey, it was an accident, all right? These things happen. An accident, Rachel snapped. You've been parked here all day and somehow you just happened to back into my mailbox? I'm not buying it. The man shrugged, clearly uninterested in arguing. Take it up with the company. We're just contractors. Fuming, Rachel took photos of the damage before retreating back inside. She forwarded them to Mark, who responded almost immediately. This strengthens our case. Document everything, no matter how small. We'll use it to show a pattern of harassment. That evening, as Rachel tried to decompress, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew her attention once again. She peeked through the curtains and saw Douglas walking along the edge of the property, flashlight in hand. He was inspecting the stakes and tape, nodding to himself as if satisfied with his work. The sight of him so smug, so brazen made Rachel's blood boil. She stepped outside, unable to contain herself any longer. What are you doing now, Douglas? He turned to her slowly, his flashlight casting an eerie glow across his face. Just making sure everything's in order, he said coolly. You know, preparing for the changes. There aren't going to be any changes, Rachel shot back. Your little project is over. I filed an injunction. Douglas chuckled, the sound low and condescending. An injunction? That's cute. But you should know by now, Rachel, these things take time. And while you're busy fighting in court, I'll be moving forward. You'll see. Her fists clenched at her sides. This isn't a game, Douglas. You're trespassing, harassing me, and damaging my property. I'm not going to let you get away with this. Let me. His smirk widened. Rachel, you're in over your head. This land's been mine longer than you've been here, and no fancy lawyer or piece of paper is going to change that. With that, he turned and walked away, his flashlight bobbing with each step. Rachel stood there, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream, to tear down the stakes and tape herself, but she knew that would only escalate things further. She had to stay calm, stay strategic. The next morning, however, things took an even darker turn. When Rachel went outside to check on the property, she found the oak tree in her yard, the same one Douglas had been fixated on, badly damaged. Deep cuts had been made into the trunk with what looked like an axe, weakening the tree significantly. It swayed precariously in the wind, its once proud branches now drooping as if in defeat. Rachel's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about the driveway or property lines anymore. Douglas was trying to destroy everything that made her home hers, piece by piece, and she realized with a sinking certainty that he wouldn't stop until she had nothing left. Rachel was no stranger to frustration, but as she stood before the mutilated remains of her oak tree, she realized this conflict with Douglas was moving into dangerous, uncharted territory. The deep gouges in the trunk weren't the result of negligence or nature, they were deliberate, vicious strikes aimed at weakening the tree until it fell. She ran her fingers over the rough cuts, her mind racing. How far was Douglas willing to go? Was this his way of sending a message? If so, it was clear no part of her property was safe. Determined not to let him intimidate her, Rachel called a professional arborist to assess the damage. When the arborist arrived later that afternoon, a wiry man in his 60s with a calm, steady demeanor, he shook his head as soon as he saw the tree. "This was no accident," he said, running his hand along the damaged bark. "Someone took an axe to this tree, and they knew exactly what they were doing. These cuts weaken the structural integrity. If you get a strong enough wind, this tree will come right down." Rachel clenched her fists at her sides. "Is there any way to save it?" The arborist hesitated, then nodded. "It'll take some work, and there's no guarantee, but we can try reinforcing it. I'll install some supports and treat the cuts to prevent further decay." "Do it," Rachel said firmly. She couldn't let Douglas win. She watched as the arborist and his team got to work, their tools buzzing and clanging as they did everything possible to stabilize the tree. She took photos of the damage for Mark, adding them to her growing file of evidence. Later that evening, Rachel sat on her porch, staring out at the now braced oak tree. The sight of the supports holding it upright filled her with a strange mix of relief and anger. Douglas had pushed her too far. It wasn't just about the driveway or even the tree anymore, it was about defending her home, her sanctuary, from a man who seemed intent on tearing it apart. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Mark. She answered quickly, eager for an update. "I've got some news," Mark said. "We've secured the injunction. Douglas can't legally make any changes to the property until the dispute is resolved in court." Rachel exhaled, a small weight lifting from her shoulders. Finally, some good news, but will that actually stop him? Mark paused. "That depends on how far he's willing to push the boundaries. The injunction is enforceable, but it's up to you to report any violations. If he so much as moves one of those stakes or dumps another pile of gravel, let me know immediately." "Trust me, I will," Rachel said. "But what about the damage he's already done? The driveway, the tree, he's getting away with everything." "For now," Mark said carefully. "But we're building a case. The more evidence we collect, the stronger our position will be in court. I know it's frustrating, Rachel, but these things take time. It was always about time, and Douglas was using it to his advantage." Rachel thanked Mark and hung up, but the conversation left her feeling hollow. She knew she couldn't rely solely on the legal system. Douglas was too brazen, too confident, and she needed to find out why. The next morning, Rachel decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with her camera and a notebook, she began meticulously documenting every inch of her property. She measured the distance between the stakes and the house, noted the placement of the orange tape, and photographed the gravel piles still sitting untouched near the edge of her driveway. Her goal was simple: to leave no room for Douglas to manipulate the narrative. As she worked, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Taking pictures for your scrapbook." Rachel turned sharply to see Douglas standing a few feet away, leaning casually against one of the stakes. His smug grin made her skin crawl. "What do you want, Douglas?" she said, her tone icy. "Just checking on my property," he replied, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "Making sure you're not tampering with anything." This isn't your property and you know it, Rachel snapped. The court agrees with me, by the way. You're not allowed to touch anything until this is resolved. Douglas's grin widened. The court? Oh, Rachel, you think a piece of paper is going to stop me? You don't understand how things work out here. I've been in this neighborhood a long time, and I know how to get things done. Rachel's heart pounded, but she refused to let him see her fear. Touch anything else, and I'll report you. Try me. Douglas's expression darkened for a moment, the mask of smugness slipping to reveal something colder, more calculating. Then, just as quickly, it returned. Have it your way, he said lightly. But don't say I didn't warn you. He turned and walked away, leaving Rachel trembling with anger. She wanted to scream, to throw something, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to lose control, not when Douglas was clearly trying to provoke her. That evening, Rachel decided to dig deeper. She reached out to a few of her neighbors, hoping to learn more about Douglas and his history in the area. Most of them were polite but evasive, offering vague comments about how Douglas had strong opinions and liked things a certain way. It wasn't until she spoke to an elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan that she got a clearer picture. Oh, Douglas has been causing trouble for years, Mrs. Callahan said, her voice low as if she feared being overheard. He's always finding ways to push people out or claim more land. The Smiths down the street? He harassed them for months until they finally sold their house. And the Johnsons? He convinced them that their fence was on his property and tore it down himself. Rachel's stomach churned. Why hasn't anyone stopped him? Mrs. Callahan sighed. He's got connections, knows how to work the system. Most people just give up, figure it's easier than fighting him. Rachel thanked Mrs. Callahan and returned home, her mind racing. If what the woman said was true, then Douglas wasn't just a difficult neighbor, he was a predator, exploiting loopholes and intimidation to get what he wanted. But Rachel wasn't like the others. She wouldn't give up, no matter how hard he pushed. That night, as Rachel sat in her living room, she heard a noise outside, soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to put her on edge. She turned off the lights and peered out the window, her heart racing. In the faint glow of the moon, she saw a figure near the oak tree. It was Douglas, holding what looked like a spray can. He was painting something on the supports the arborist had installed earlier that week. Rachel grabbed her phone and dialed the police, her hands shaking. She described the situation as calmly as she could, insisting that someone come out immediately. To her surprise, the dispatcher took her seriously, promising to send an officer to investigate. When the officer arrived, Douglas was gone, but the evidence was clear. The supports were covered in crude, spray-painted messages, "Keep out," and "This isn't yours." The officer took Rachel's statement and promised to file a report, but Rachel could see the doubt in his eyes. Without catching Douglas in the act, there wasn't much they could do. Still, the incident left Rachel more determined than ever. She sent the photos of the vandalism to Mark, who responded with a plan they would request a formal review of the property boundaries, using both her survey and historical records to prove her case. It was a small step, but it was progress. As she lay in bed that night, Rachel stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Douglas wasn't just a bully, he was methodical, calculating, and relentless. But so was she, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't just want to win, she wanted to make sure Douglas never did this to anyone else again. The days after Douglas's latest act of vandalism passed in tense silence. Rachel tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, working on her art in the mornings and keeping track of every interaction with Douglas in the afternoons. She knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down, not when every small victory seemed to fuel his desire to escalate. The supports on her oak tree had been replaced, and the spray paint scrubbed off, but the symbolic damage lingered. That tree was her anchor, a testament to the stability she sought in this house, and Douglas had made it clear he was willing to destroy it just to rattle her. Her lawyer, Mark, had made progress with the legal side of things. A formal review of the property lines was scheduled, and the injunction remained in place, technically preventing Douglas from making any further changes. But Rachel knew better than to rely on technicalities. Douglas had proven time and again that he didn't play by the rules, and she could feel the tension building, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The storm broke one chilly morning when Rachel opened her front door to find a large, official-looking notice taped to the frame. The bold lettering at the top read "Notice of Property Violation." Her stomach dropped as she tore it down and scanned the contents. The notice accused her of unauthorized alterations to the disputed driveway and claimed she was in violation of local regulations for encroaching on Douglas's property. It demanded that she cease all activity immediately and threatened fines if she didn't comply. She called Mark immediately, her voice shaking with frustration. "He's filing bogus complaints now. I just got a notice accusing me of violating his so-called property." "How is he even allowed to do this?" Mark sighed on the other end of the line. "It's a tactic, Rachel. He's trying to pressure you into backing down by making this as stressful and costly as possible. These notices are usually automated once someone submits a formal complaint to the local authorities. We'll contest it, but it's going to take time." Rachel muttered bitterly. "That's all anyone ever says. Meanwhile, he's free to do whatever he wants." "Not exactly," Mark replied. "He's bound by the injunction, remember? If he's overstepping, we'll catch him. Just keep documenting everything." But Rachel's patience was wearing thin. She spent the next few days fielding calls from local inspectors who wanted to schedule a review of the alleged violations. One of them arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, and began walking the property without so much as knocking on her door. When Rachel confronted him, he explained, "We received multiple complaints about unpermitted work here. I'm just doing my job." Complaints from who she demanded, though she already knew the answer. The inspector's shrug was infuriating. "I can't disclose that. But you'll need to provide documentation showing any work you've done was properly permitted." Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "I haven't done any work. This is my property, and I'm not the one tearing it apart." The inspector didn't seem particularly interested in her side of the story. He snapped a few photos, jotted down some notes, and left with a vague promise to follow up. Rachel watched him drive away, feeling both violated and powerless. Douglas was weaponizing the system against her, and the worst part was that it seemed to be working. Later that evening, as she was reviewing the photos she'd taken of the tree and the stakes, she noticed something odd in one of the images. Near the far edge of her property, where the stakes met the gravel pile Douglas had left behind, there was a small square metal box partially buried in the dirt. She hadn't seen it before, likely because it was hidden under the rubble. Curious, she grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The air was crisp and quiet as she made her way to the spot. Kneeling down, she brushed away the gravel and dirt until the box was fully exposed. It was old and rusted, with a hinged lid that creaked as she pried it open. Inside was a collection of faded documents, maps, receipts, and what appeared to be an old survey of the neighborhood. Rachel's heart raced as she flipped through them, her flashlight illuminating faded handwriting and official seals. One document stood out, an original survey map from decades ago, long before Douglas had moved into his house. The map clearly marked her property lines, and they matched the boundaries in her own records. But there was something else, a series of handwritten annotations, marked with dates and initials, showing subtle but deliberate changes to the lines over time. It was as if someone had been slowly altering the official records, piece by piece, to expand the neighboring lot. Douglas's lot. Rachel's mind raced. This was the proof she needed, evidence that Douglas's claims weren't just false but part of a calculated plan. She carefully tucked the documents back into the box and carried it inside, her hands shaking with a mix of triumph and fear. She emailed scans of the key pages to Mark immediately, including a note that simply read, "I found this buried under the gravel pile. It's exactly what we've been looking for." Mark called her back within minutes. "Rachel, this is huge. If we can verify the authenticity of these documents, it's game over for Douglas. But we need to be careful. He's not going to take this lying down." Mark's words proved prophetic. The next morning, Rachel woke to find her yard in chaos. The stakes and tape were gone, replaced by deep trenches that had been dug overnight. The gravel pile was scattered across her lawn, as if someone had deliberately tried to make the area look like a construction zone. And in the center of it all was Douglas, standing with a group of workers who looked like they had no idea what they'd gotten themselves into. Rachel stormed outside, her anger boiling over. "What the hell do you think you're doing now?" Douglas turned to her, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Morning, Rachel. Just making some adjustments. You should really stay inside, wouldn't want you to trip and hurt yourself. This is illegal. And you know it," she shouted. "The injunction." "Oh, the injunction," Douglas interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "I'm not doing anything permanent, just clearing some debris. That's not covered by your precious court order." Rachel clenched her fists, knowing he was skirting the line just enough to avoid immediate consequences. "You think you can keep pushing me like this? You're not going to win, Douglas." He smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent a chill down her spine. "We'll see about that." As she retreated back into the house to call Mark, Rachel felt a surge of resolve. Douglas might have connections and a willingness to cross every line, but she had the truth on her side, and now she had the evidence to prove it. The battle was far from over, but for the first time Rachel felt like she had a fighting chance. The culmination of Rachel's battle with Douglas began on a gray, overcast morning when she received an urgent call from Mark. His tone was sharp, almost breathless as he spoke. "Rachel, we verified the documents you found under the gravel pile. They're authentic. Whoever altered those property records did it deliberately, and it's all tied to Douglas. We can use this to destroy his case in court." Rachel's heart surged with relief, but Mark wasn't finished. "I've already filed a motion to submit these documents as evidence, but here's the thing, you're not just dealing with property disputes anymore. This crosses into fraud. If we can prove Douglas knowingly manipulated those records, it's a criminal offense." The weight of his words hit her. This wasn't just about her driveway or her property. Douglas's entire scheme was unraveling, and it wasn't going to end quietly. She thanked Mark and hung up, feeling the nervous energy building in her chest. For the first time, she had the upper hand. But Douglas must have sensed it, too. That same afternoon, Rachel returned home from a quick trip to the store to find her front yard in chaos. The supports on her oak tree had been removed, leaving the massive trunk swaying precariously in the wind. Her flower beds had been trampled, and the trenches Douglas's workers had dug were now filled with standing water, turning her lawn into a muddy swamp. Standing in the middle of it all, like a general surveying his battlefield, was Douglas. His arms were crossed, and he was smirking as Rachel pulled into the driveway. She slammed the car door and marched toward him, her voice trembling with rage. "What the hell have you done now, Douglas?" He didn't even flinch. "Just cleaning up some debris," he said casually, gesturing to the destruction around him. "This land's going to look a lot better once it's mine." Rachel stepped closer, her fists clenched at her sides. "This land isn't yours, and you know it. I've got the proof now. Your little game is over." Douglas's smirk faltered, just for a moment before he regained his composure. "Proof? That's cute. But let me tell you something, Rachel, court cases take time. Even if you've got your fancy lawyer and some old papers, I'll drag this out for years if I have to. You're wasting your energy." Rachel stared at him, her anger giving way to something colder, sharper. "You're scared," she said, her voice low. "You wouldn't be pulling all this if you thought you could win." Douglas's expression darkened. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing in the wreckage of her yard. She watched him disappear into his house, her mind racing. She couldn't wait for the court to act, not when Douglas was this desperate, this dangerous. She called Mark again, detailing the latest damage. His response was immediate. "We need to escalate this. I'll file for an emergency hearing to address the vandalism and the fraud. But you need to stay safe, Rachel. If he's acting out like this, there's no telling what he'll do next." That night, Rachel barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside, set her on edge. She kept a flashlight and her phone by her side, ready for anything. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The next day, the emergency hearing was granted. Mark picked Rachel up early in the morning, his briefcase packed with evidence, the altered property records, the photos of the vandalism, the statements from neighbors about Douglas's long history of intimidation. Rachel felt a flicker of hope as they drove to the courthouse, though it was tempered by the knowledge that Douglas wouldn't go down without a fight. As they entered the courtroom, Rachel was struck by how calm Douglas looked. He sat at the defendant's table with a lawyer she hadn't seen before, his expression unreadable. When the hearing began, Mark wasted no time laying out their case. "Your Honor, my client has endured months of harassment, vandalism, and intimidation at the hands of Mr. Douglas. But this isn't just a property dispute. We have concrete evidence that Mr. Douglas has been altering official property records to fraudulently expand his land holdings. These documents, combined with witness testimony, prove a pattern of calculated deceit." Mark presented the survey maps Rachel had found, the photos of the damage to her property, and even the cryptic notes Douglas had left in her mailbox. As he spoke, Rachel watched the judge's expression shift from neutral to sharp, his eyes narrowing as he examined the evidence. Douglas's lawyer tried to counter, arguing that the documents were irrelevant and the damage to Rachel's property was unintentional. But it was clear they were grasping at straws. When the judge asked Douglas directly about the altered records, he hesitated for the first time, stammering something about miscommunications and clerical errors. The turning point came when Mark called a surprise witness, a former contractor who had worked for Douglas years ago. The man testified that Douglas had a habit of pushing boundaries, often instructing workers to extend fences or dig trenches beyond the legal property lines. "He told us not to worry about permits," the contractor said, his voice steady. "Said he'd handle it if anyone asked questions." Rachel could see the tension in Douglas's shoulders as the testimony unfolded. His calm facade was cracking, and she felt a grim satisfaction watching him squirm. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was firm. "The evidence presented today is compelling. The altered property records alone warrant further investigation, but combined with the clear pattern of harassment and property damage, it's evident that Mr. Douglas has acted in bad faith. I'm granting an immediate injunction to prevent any further activity on the disputed land. Additionally, I'm referring this case for criminal investigation into the allegations of fraud." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It was more than she had hoped for. Douglas's lawyer looked pale, while Douglas himself sat frozen, his jaw tight. The judge turned to Rachel. "Ms. Green, I understand this has been a difficult process for you. While this injunction doesn't resolve the ownership dispute entirely, it ensures no further harm will come to your property until the matter is fully adjudicated." Rachel nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to respond. She felt the weight of months of fear and frustration begin to lift, replaced by a sense of vindication. As they left the courthouse, Mark turned to her with a rare smile. "You did it, Rachel. This is the beginning of the end for him." But Rachel wasn't celebrating yet. She knew Douglas wouldn't take this defeat quietly. Still, as she stood on the courthouse steps, the clouds breaking to reveal a sliver of sunlight, she allowed herself a moment of hope. For the first time in months, she felt like she was winning. The aftermath of the court hearing left Rachel with a strange sense of calm. For months, her life had been consumed by Douglas's relentless attempts to destroy her peace, and now, for the first time, she had something solid to hold on to, an injunction to protect her property and the looming threat of criminal charges against Douglas. But she knew the battle wasn't over. It was a pause, not a victory lap. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Rachel kept a close watch on her property, half expecting Douglas to lash out in retaliation, but he remained unseen. The orange stakes were gone, the gravel piles had been removed, and the damaged trenches were filled in, likely a condition imposed by his lawyer. The absence of his presence, however, didn't ease the tension Rachel carried. It felt like the calm before a storm. One afternoon, as she was repairing the flower beds that Douglas's workers had trampled, a car pulled into her driveway. For a moment, her chest tightened, but she relaxed when she saw it was Mark. He stepped out, holding a thick folder and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just closed an important deal. "I've got news," he said as he approached. "The criminal investigation is moving forward. Turns out Douglas's fraudulent property claims go back years. The county's looking into at least 3 other cases where he pulled similar stunts. They've already frozen his assets while they investigate." Rachel's eyes widened. Frozen his assets? That's huge. Does that mean? Mark nodded. It means he won't have the resources to drag this out in court like he threatened. He's cornered. The best part? His lawyer reached out to negotiate a settlement. The word settlement sent a wave of relief through Rachel. After everything she had endured, the thought of an end to this nightmare felt almost surreal. What's he offering? She asked cautiously. Mark opened the folder and handed her a document. He's agreed to drop all claims to your property, pay for the damages to your driveway and tree, and cover all your legal fees. In exchange, he wants you to waive your right to pursue additional civil action once the criminal case is resolved. Rachel scanned the document, her fingers trembling slightly. It was more than she'd hoped for. She looked up at Mark. Is it worth it? Waiving the right to sue later? Mark's expression softened. Given the criminal charges he's facing, I'd say it's a fair trade. The restitution he's offering will more than cover what you've lost, and it means you won't have to deal with him anymore. It's your call, though. Rachel took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She thought about the months of stress, the nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what Douglas would do next. She thought about the oak tree, now standing strong again with its supports in place, a testament to her resilience. Finally, she nodded. I'll sign it. I just want my life back. The agreement was finalized within days. True to his word, Douglas ceded all claims to her property, and the contractors he hired returned to restore the damage they had caused. Rachel watched from her porch as they poured fresh concrete for her driveway and replanted some of the flowers that had been destroyed. The sight filled her with a sense of closure, as though the pieces of her life were finally falling back into place. News of Douglas's criminal investigation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Rachel began receiving cautious smiles and nods from neighbors who had once been too intimidated to take her side. Mrs. Callahan even stopped by with a basket of fresh muffins. You did what no one else could, the older woman said with a warm smile. You stood up to him. We're all grateful. Rachel accepted the gesture with gratitude but remained humble. She hadn't set out to become a hero, she'd just wanted to protect her home. Still, knowing her actions had made the community a little safer brought her a quiet sense of pride. A few weeks later, Rachel stood in her front yard, gazing at the oak tree as the late afternoon sun bathed it in golden light. The driveway was smooth and new, the flower beds vibrant once again. Her home felt like hers again, not a battleground, but a sanctuary. As she walked back inside, Rachel paused at her easel, where a half-finished painting waited. It was a piece she'd started during the worst of the conflict, the brushstrokes raw and chaotic. Now, she saw something different in it, a story of resilience, of reclaiming peace against all odds. She picked up her brush and began to paint, her movements steady and deliberate. Douglas was gone, his reign of terror reduced to a cautionary tale, and for the first time in months, Rachel felt free.